last week we looked at this timeline. So essentially what we looked at was from when Jesus Christ would soon return, or the events that would happen before that in the world, that we could look at and think, okay, how do we know that the world is reaching a point where Jesus is going to return? Then we tracked through how Jesus would return, gather all of us as saints, and we went through the judgment, the resurrection, how we'd be brought to immortality, and then the marriage supper of the Lamb, and then finally being handed over by the angels, like the role, this transition role of us taking over the work of the angels. And then we finally reached this point where the world was on the cusp of Armageddon. And I guess what we said, which is good to just keep in our minds, while we're taken away, the world is slowly going to descend into this period of trouble. And that's how Daniel describes it. He describes it as a time of trouble such as never was. Now that doesn't sound like a fun time, does it? And that it's not going to be a fun time for the world. The world is going to go through some immense trouble. But I guess what we've got to try and keep in mind through this whole thing is that that's not the end goal in which God has for his purpose. God is not excited to bring war and trouble to this world. He's excited to bring peace and righteousness to this world. And the process in which he's going to get that essentially has to go through this period of judgment and this period of war, which we're going to look at tonight. So we've been brought right to the very cusp of this period of time of Armageddon. So what we're going to look at tonight is we're going to look at Armageddon, what that battle is, how that happens, and then the events that will follow Armageddon until finally Jesus Christ is established as king upon the earth and he has established his rulership. So that's the period in purple that we're going to look at tonight. Now, I guess when people think of Armageddon, and does anyone know where Armageddon is mentioned in the Bible? Yeah, sorry, it's a pretty easy question, wasn't it? Right, Revelation 16 verse 9, and no one actually even noticed it except Dad. Right, it's only mentioned once in the entire Bible, actually. Once in the entire Bible, this idea of Armageddon. And I guess when people think of Armageddon, there's all sorts of crazy ideas about it because of all the movies that have come out about Armageddon and all the different things that are going to happen. But I guess at the core of man has always been worried, particularly over the last 100 years, about what the future of mankind is. In World War I, 40 million people were killed. In World War II, 75 million people were killed. And when you look back, that's getting close to 100 years since World War II. And how much has man advanced in his technology in that space of time? And I guess it's only been because of the threat of nuclear war that's perhaps left mankind in a position where there's never been a major war since. But man's always worried, hasn't he? And I suppose these movies are evidences to that the world is going to eventually be brought to this point of World War III. And people are worried that ultimately, what's that going to bring to the world? Like, you look at some of the technology that people have got today, like with AI and robots. If you've looked at some of the robots that people are inventing, like there's dog robots with machine guns on top of them. The Chinese are developing, full human robot armies. It's like, you imagine what's going to happen and what man will do with this world. And it's no wonder that men are worried about the future of mankind itself. But I guess from the outset, God tells us this. Sorry, I'll just go back to that quote. He says in Isaiah 45 verse 18, he says, "For thus says the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it, he hath created it not in vain, but he formed it to be inhabited." God's not going to let the world be destroyed. If man was left to himself, absolutely he'd destroy it. But God is not going to allow that. And his plan is to fill the earth with his glory, and he will do that. But in the process of that, he's going to have to go through this war called Armageddon. Now, what does Armageddon mean? If you break down the Hebrew word, It means Armageddon, and it means a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. A heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. And the idea is of how they used to beat the wheat. I don't know anything about beating wheat, and I'm sure most people here don't either. But what they used to do was they used to gather the wheat at the end of the season, and they would put it in this this area where they would beat the wheat, and they would beat that wheat until what would happen is all the quality grain would go to the bottom, and all of the chaff would go up into the air, and the wind would come and blow that away, and all that would be left would be the good grain. And that's the idea that Armageddon is talking about. It's talking about this moment where the nations are going to come together to be beaten, and ultimately the chaff will come up and be blown away, and in its place will be left the wheat that will be good wheat that will grow to fill the earth. What does that symbology remind you of? What prophecy does it remind you of? We talked about it last week, about something being smashed to powder, it being blown away, and then something growing in its place. Jack? The image, that's exactly right. And there's an allusion to that in this idea of Armageddon. The kingdoms of men are going to be smashed, and the kingdom of God is going to rise in its place. Now, Armageddon, the war, is sort of mentioned in quite a lot of passages in Scripture. Can anyone think of some of the main passages where we get the idea of this Armageddon war? Revelation 16 is one, that's obviously where it's mentioned. There's a couple of key Old Testament prophecies which basically there's a whole chapter about this war. Don't be afraid. Zechariah 14 is definitely one. Joel chapter 3 is definitely another one. They're the main ones, actually. Revelation 16, Zechariah 14, Joel 3, Daniel 2, and Daniel 11, which is the reading that Anthony read for us tonight. So they're the main chapters which talk about this war of Armageddon. Now, we're going to skip pretty quickly through this war, and I know that many of you know the details of it anyway, so it's just good to see it all in progression. But I guess the idea behind it, Zechariah 14, and we will go to Zechariah 14 a little bit later on, but he says, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. So that's essentially what Armageddon is. It is World War III. All nations of the earth are going to be drawn together to Jerusalem to battle. So the battle is centred in the Middle East, and it's going to involve all nations of the earth in some capacity. Whether every nation will fight, certainly every nation will join a team, and it'll all be centred around Jerusalem. Now, how do we know when this is going to happen? I guess one of the main things is Zechariah says in verse 1, he says, once the captives of Judah and Jerusalem have returned, then these things will come to pass. Now, that could only be after 1967, can't it? Because in 1948, Israel became a nation, and in 1967, Jerusalem was recaptured by the Jews. So sometime after 1967, this war will happen. And I think that we're seeing this war develop right now before our very eyes in the Middle East. So, the first thing that's going to happen in this Battle of Armageddon is we're going to see this invasion of Gog. Now, Gog is a term which is used in Ezekiel chapter 38, and that's the other chapter which talks about Armageddon. And we're going to have a look tonight at Daniel chapter 11. So if you turn to Daniel chapter 11, we'll just go through those 5 verses, and they sort of outline the progression of this particular war. So verse 40 says, and at the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and he shall overflow and pass over. So this group of nations is styled the king of the north here in Daniel chapter 11, and in Ezekiel chapter 38, it's called Gog. And what's described for us here in Daniel chapter 11 is an alliance, an allegiance of nations which are going to come down ultimately against the nation of Israel to invade the nation of Israel. So here's a picture of the Middle East as we know it today, and we're just going to have a look at some of the key moves that the King of the North will make. Now, we're not going to go into proving who the King of the North is, but we're all pretty familiar with the fact that we believe that it's Russia as the key nation involved in as the King of the North, and he will be in allegiance with a number of other nations at that particular time. Now, I've put in orange the nations that we believe will be in allegiance with the King of the North, or Gog. So obviously Russia here, and it goes right up here. I can't put it all on the map, right? But Russia is one of the key nations, and other nations in Eastern and Western Europe will also be part of that alliance. And then as we move down to the Middle East, we're told that Iran, Iraq, Syria, some of these Arab nations, and Libya and Turkey will also join this alliance with the King of the North. Okay, now when you look at that map, and you look at a map of Israel today, or the map of the Middle East today, we can see a lot of similarities between the map that is evolving in the Middle East today and the map that was described that would happen or come together at the time of the end. There's probably one nation that's not completely aligned, and what nation do you think that would be on that map there? I'm talking about alignment with Russia completely. Turkey, I would say, right? Turkey's obviously an independent nation, but they will very much be, as described in Ezekiel chapter 38, a key nation in that alliance. Now, whether they join the alliance or whether they're taken by force, we don't exactly know. But why do you reckon they're such an important strategic position for ultimately the King of the North to take? What is it about Turkey which is so important? The Dardanelles, that's right, and the Bosphorus that takes through here. This is such an essential passageway, and is where we fought, not we personally, but the nation of Australia fought at Gallipoli, because it was such an important position, and always is such an important position in war, the bridge between Europe and Asia. Okay, so that is an essential thing for Russia to take, and it must take it, because that's the only way that it can get its navy out into the Mediterranean. Now, let's have a look at, once he's made this allegiance with these particular nations, we're then told that he moves down and makes his next move, verse 41. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, and these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So the next nation, we're told that when he makes his move, and Ezekiel chapter 38 says he's going to have, for some reason, he's going to be dragged down into the Middle East, with hooks in his jaws. And the next nation he's going to take is Egypt. He's going to be taken down into this area, and he's going to take and possess the nation of Egypt. Why is Egypt so important? Strategically, for an invading country. The Suez Canal. Auntie Heather's all over it, right? She's just nailing it. She knows her war history. The Suez Canal is essential if you're going to try and take over the world, because it's such an important access route into the Mediterranean again. And what I find interesting about that is this has obviously been written thousands of years ago. The Suez Canal wasn't in existence back then, but it maps out perfectly, if someone's going to move down in the Middle East, it maps out perfectly the key strategic locations they would need to take in order to be able to move into that particular area. So he moves into here, and he's got this huge area which is surrounding the nation of Israel. And it's at that point that he then, Ezekiel 38 says, that he then takes a look up north to this nation of Israel, and it says in Ezekiel 38, he has an evil thought, and he thinks, hang on a second, this area here is just such a prosperous nation. Maybe if I've moved down into this whole area, I could take a leap into the nation of Israel, and Jerusalem in particular, which is the treasure of all the world. And he thinks that evil thought. And we're told here in verse 44 what then happens. It says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth in a great fury to destroy and utterly to take away many. Now, So what happens is, out of the east and out of the north, there is tidings or reports that come to him. Now, there's differing opinions as to what that is, whether that's Jesus. He gets evidence that Jesus is in the earth, or there's another army. I tend to think that perhaps what that is there's other nations that are in the area, Ezekiel chapter 38 tells us. These nations down here that we're told will be in the area of Saudi Arabia are a group of nations which join together at this particular time to oppose the invasion of this particular northern force. And we're told that those nations will be made up of Saudi Arabia and, of course, England and some of her allies, which we assume would probably be America, Australia, and some of those other key English-speaking nations and other allies of England. And we're told that what they will do at that particular time is they will try and push back at this particular alliance and say, we don't want you coming into Jerusalem. And people have suggested that perhaps they do move into Jerusalem. They must move into Jerusalem in some capacity to defend them, because that's where the ultimate war is going to be fought. And all nations are going to be brought to Jerusalem. So perhaps the tidings or reports that he hears in the north are of these particular group of nations moving into Jerusalem to bolster up Jerusalem and try and be there as a defence to them. But what does the king of the north do? Well, that doesn't deter him. In fact, that makes him angry. And in the middle of verse 41 it says, therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and to utterly take away many. So he sees his opportunity. There it is. And he goes, I'm going to strike. And he moves into Jerusalem, into the nation of Israel and into Jerusalem itself. And he brings about great havoc in the nation of Israel. And what happens to the west? Well, they're defeated. Right? And it's not I don't think surprising to see that that's going to happen in light of what we've seen in recent history in the way wars have been fought. Like America withdrew from Afghanistan, they struggled in Iraq and had to ultimately withdraw from there. And those nations are weak nations. Yet the nation of America, in order to bring all of its force into here to try and win a battle, and then particularly against a foe such as Russia, and particularly against a foe such as Russia that is allied with all these other nations, it's going to be incredibly difficult, and they will lose. America and her allies, and Britain and her allies, will be defeated by Russia at that particular point. And Daniel chapter 45 goes on to say this, and he shall plant his tabernacles and his palace between the seas of the glorious mountain. So he's going to move right into the centre here between the sea on this side, which is the Mediterranean, and the sea on the other side, which is the Dead Sea. And he's going to plant his camp there. And Israel is going to be decimated. And I find that really sad to think about because, we've watched the nation of Israel, haven't we? A lot of us, some of our older ones, can remember some of the key events in the nation of Israel. We've watched that nation be reformed as a nation upon the earth and fight all these battles throughout the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years of their history. And it's difficult not to sort of be rooting for the nation of Israel and wanting them to succeed. And we see them at the moment getting further and further pushed and disliked by the rest of the world, pushed back into a corner. But ultimately they're going to be decimated. They're going to be destroyed. And that's a terrible thing that they've got to go through. That nation, look at what they've already been through. The Holocaust, the worst tragedy in human history. And yet they're going to have to endure more. And this is what Zechariah says is going to happen. He says, for I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravaged, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So the city of Jerusalem is going to be smashed, and its people are going to be scattered. Zechariah 13 says that 2/3 shall be cut off, and they're going to be perished. So an enormous amount of death and tragedy is going to happen to the nation of Israel. And we're told that the only remaining ones will have to flee. And interestingly, it says they'll flee east. And the Arab nations, many of the Arab nations who have hated Israel for generations, they will be some of the ones that will take in Israel as they flee for their life. Nations like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, we're told in Isaiah, will be the ones that will rescue the nation of Israel as they come across the border, running and fleeing from Jerusalem as it has been captured. And there Gog will sit, the king of the north, having moved down into the Middle East and taken Turkey and taken Egypt, and now he's moved into Israel and he's actually taken and defeated Jerusalem. But look what Daniel says in verse 45 again. We'll just read that again. He says, and he shall plant his tabernacles or his tents, so his camp, of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. So right there in Jerusalem will he set up his headquarters. And then it says what he'll do at the end of verse 45 is it says, yet he shall come to his end and none shall help him. So just when it seems like this king of the north has defeated everyone and there's no one else that could possibly defeat him, it's at that moment that Daniel tells us that out of nowhere, someone comes to completely destroy him. Now, who is that? Well, of course, it's obviously Jesus Christ. So let's just go back. Let's go over to Zechariah chapter 14, because Zechariah 14 then fills out the details of exactly how Jesus is going to do this. So Gog is invaded. The next stage in the timeline is Jesus Christ will be revealed. And Zechariah 14 describes how he will be revealed at this moment. He's going to be revealed at the moment when Israel is lost, when they've got no one to turn to. And I guess that's how God wants them. God wants them with no one to turn to be alone and without anyone to turn to in this world. And verse 3 describes what he'll then do. It says, then shall Yahweh go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. Now, Zechariah uses the name Yahweh. And it is Yahweh, but it will be in the form of Jesus Christ at this particular moment, because that's who will be representing God as he moves in to this area of Jerusalem, having returned to the earth, as we saw last week. And verse 4 says this, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. And that's what he said to the disciples, didn't he? In Acts chapter 1, he says, just as you've seen me go into heaven, I'm going to so return, I'm going to come back to this very place in Jerusalem that I have come from. So Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the middle thereof towards the east and towards the west. And there shall be a very, very great valley, and half the mountains shall remove towards the north, and half of the mountains shall move towards the south. So Jesus is going to enter Jerusalem from the east. And if you've been to Jerusalem today, you've probably been told the story when you stand on the Mount of Olives and you look at that famous view into Jerusalem and you see the Dome of the Rock, that picture that is taken 1,000,000 times. And you'll notice on that side of Jerusalem, which is on the east side, there's the east gate of Jerusalem, which has always been blocked off and not opened. Because the Jews have always believed that that's where Messiah will come from in order to free them and save them. And so he will. He's going to return, like Zechariah says, and come from the east. And when his feet touch the Mount of Olives, we're told by Zechariah that there's going to be this massive physical earthquake which will take place. And the earthquake is described as going from east to, it's going to separate and create a crater, and one side of the mountain goes to the east and one side of the mountain goes to the west. Now, if you look at a map of Jerusalem and you look at the tectonic plates which go around the world, there is a major fault line which runs from all the way up the line of the Dead Sea. It runs all the way up the Dead Sea, then all the way up the Jordan, all the way through the nation of Israel. from the bottom of Israel through to the top of Israel. So I can imagine what's going to happen is the earthquake is going to be triggered by that particular fault line, and it will divide a valley that will break the Mount of Olives from east to west. So an enormous earthquake. And Ezekiel 38 describes this great earthquake as well. It says this: "For in my jealousy and in my blazing wrath I declare on that day that there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. And the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field and all the creeping things that creep on the ground." So the epicenter of that earthquake is going to be in the nation of Israel and in Jerusalem itself. And it's going to cause an enormous amount of destruction in Jerusalem. The biggest earthquake that's ever been on the earth, does anyone know what that was? I thought Caleb, surely. Surely Caleb knows. 9.4, yes, absolutely correct. Do you know where it was? Of course. The one I was thinking of was the one in Chile. Yeah, so that's the one I read that was the biggest one. Same fault line, of course, right? Just see Caleb afterwards for more information. All right, so that was a 9.4 and it caused enormous destruction. We've seen earthquakes half that size in New Zealand and other places cause enormous destruction. How much destruction is this earthquake going to cause? Well, it says here that it's going to then fit all people who are on the face of the earth shall quake at my presence. So it seems like the earthquake is not just going to affect Jerusalem, but it will permeate throughout all of the earth. Now, I don't think that earthquake, from what you can have a look at in Scripture, I don't think the purpose of that earthquake, and I sort of remember thinking that as a kid, that when the earthquake's going to come, what it's going to be is Jesus is going to put his feet on the Mount of Olives, and the earthquake's going to go through the world and just destroy and kill every single person, right? That's actually not the purpose of what the earthquake is. What it is to A, destroy Gog and his force in Jerusalem, and the other thing it's to do is to make the world aware that Jesus Christ is in the earth, or that something has changed. And I think there will be a reverberation of this earthquake that will ripple across the entire earth. And everyone's going to know that something major is happening. I mean, people are still going to be watching all this stuff on their TV. People haven't removed TVs or phones at this particular point. Everyone's been watching Armageddon unfold live on their phones at this point. And then this earthquake is going to ripple through the earth. And you imagine what that's going to do to people. The fear it's going to bring, the uncertainty that it's going to bring. And it's going to go right throughout all the world. And I think ultimately what God is going to do with that earthquake is shake everyone up and to get their attention. And how hard is it to get everyone's attention today? It's hard to get my attention because I'm glued to all these different things. But God in that day is going to shake the world to get their attention. And he's going to do it via this earthquake, which is going to ripple throughout the earth. And in the nation of Israel, all the mountains will fall down and the cliffs will fall and all the walls will tumble to the ground. This massive catastrophe is going to happen in the nation of Israel. And then the next thing that will happen, I'll just stop there because this is another instance of where we're told about this earthquake that would come. Revelation 16 says, there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. Now, Revelation is describing that physical earthquake that will come upon the earth, but it's not just going to be a physical earthquake. And Revelation is talking about a symbolic earthquake that is going to hit the earth, like never before. And this event of Jesus Christ announcing himself in the world is going to change everything for the world overnight. And that's what it's describing in Revelation chapter 16. A ground-breaking, shaking event which will make this world never the same again for every person on the face of the earth. And God will announce his Son in the earth by sending that amazing earthquake. And Isaiah says this will be the result of that shaking. The haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of man shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. Every man, every nation, every allegiance of nations, not just the bad guys, everyone is going to be humbled in that day. The King of the North and America and Australia and Israel, everyone is going to be humbled in that day. That will be the ultimate result of it. So after that, after Christ is revealed in the earth by this great earthquake, we're told that Gog will be defeated. And Zechariah 14 goes on to show us how that will happen. Let's just look at a couple of verses, right? How are they going to be defeated? Verse 5 says, and ye shall flee to the valleys of the mountains. This is after the earthquake. For the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. Yea, ye shall flee like as they fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And Yahweh my God, and that's Jesus representing his God, shall come, and all the saints with thee. So Jesus is going to be with the saints. As we saw last week, we would have already been raised, and we will be with the saints and go with him in order to defeat this enemy. We're then told that, verse 12, this is another way that Gog will be destroyed. Verse 12 says, and this shall be the plague wherewith the Lord shall smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand upon their feet, and their eyes shall consume away in their holes, and their tongue shall consume away in their mouth. Pretty terrifying verse, that one, as to what's going to happen upon the earth, which gives us indication that as well as fighting against this enemy to destroy Gog, that God will use supernatural events to bring about the demise of the King of the North. And that verse there seems to indicate to me that someone's pressed the nuclear button while it's happening, while this war's been happening. I can imagine that happening. I can imagine Putin or whoever it is, just when it's all going to rubbish, they'll be pressing every single button they can. So maybe that's one of the things that will happen in this particular area to bring about the demise of the King of the North. And finally, we're also told in verse 14, this is pretty interesting, it says, and Judah also shall fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the heathen round about shall be gathered together, gold and silver and apparel and great abundance. Judah will fight. Now, Judah is the Old Testament reference to Israel, right? So Israel are going to be, natural Israel, are going to also be involved in this fight. So just like God in days past used natural Israel to fight, like with Joshua and some of those other great battles with the kings of David, he used Israel, and he often used like hailstones and all sorts of other supernatural events in order to defeat Israel's enemies. So God is somehow going to use that remnant that have survived to work a miracle through them to defeat, ultimately, this King of the North and push them out of Jerusalem. So that's going to be an amazing thing to witness how that happens. So ultimately, Gog will be defeated. And you can imagine Israel, can't you, once that happens, having been lost, having been completely smashed, and all of their allies like America and all these other nations seeing them completely destroyed and thinking, we're done for. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they have been saved. And the obvious question that they then ask, having been saved, is, who is this that has saved us from this, with this amazing victory? And it's at that point that Israel is going to be converted. So let's have a look at that in Zechariah chapter 10, 12 and verse 10. And these are some of the themes which Robbie touched on when he was looking at the nation of Israel. Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10 says, and I will pour upon the house of Israel and upon the inhabitants of Judah the spirit of grace and supplication. So just when they're at their lowest ebb, God is going to put his hand out in grace to that nation. And they, that's Israel, shall look upon me, they'll look upon God through his Son, Jesus Christ, whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourneth for his own son, and he shall be in bitterness for him, as one is in bitterness for his firstborn. So the nation of Israel, of course, will look to see who their Saviour is, and he will put up his hands and his feet, and he will show them that it was me all along that has saved you. And it's the Joseph moment, isn't it? It's the moment when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, just like Jesus will reveal himself to his brothers in the nation of Israel, and they'll be brought under his wing. And then in Zechariah chapter 13, the last verse of Zechariah chapter 13, this is ultimately what will happen to Israel. It says, "And I will bring the third part through the fire," and that's the remaining third that will survive, "and I'm going to refine them as silver is refined, and I will try them as gold is tried. And they shall call upon my name, and I will hear them, and they shall say, 'It is my people,' and they shall say, 'Yahweh is my God.'" And won't that be a beautiful moment of reconciliation, to see that nation of Israel, who has endured so much throughout the last 2,000 years since AD 70, finally they'll be brought together with their father through his son, and the family will be reunited. And Abraham's going to be there, isn't he? And Isaac's going to be there. And Jacob's going to be there. And all the brothers are going to be there to witness that and to watch that. What an amazing thing that'll be for all of that, to see, all those members to come together and be reconciled with their God. It'll be a beautiful thing to witness. And then what's going to happen? Well, then Christ is going to be announced in the world as King. And we're told that in verse 9 of Zechariah chapter 14. Verse 9 says, "And Yahweh, through his Son again, shall be king over all the earth in that day, and there shall be one Yahweh, and his name one." So at that point, Jesus is going to announce himself to the world in Jerusalem as king over the nations. And that message is somehow going to go out throughout all the world. Probably us, as his representatives, will be involved in spreading that message that Jesus Christ is in the world. Now, that is going to be... I didn't say this verse, which is it's quite an interesting verse to look at. Just before that happens, it says, "And they that dwelt in the city of Israel shall go forth, and they shall set fire and burn the weapons, both the shields and the bucklers and the bows and the arrows and the handstaves and the spears, and they shall burn them with fire 7 years." So they're going to start, after that's finished, they're going to start this process of cleaning up the nation of Israel. And it's going to take them 7 years to actually get everyone and all the stuff and all the junk and all the tanks and all the cars and the rubbish and the weapons and the missiles, to clean them all up and to bring that land back clean again. Now, while that's happening, we're told that there's going to be this ultimatum given to the nations. And as I said, maybe we'll be involved in spreading that to the nations. But let's go to Revelation chapter 14, just to see what that will be. Right, Revelation chapter 14 describes this time in the earth when Jesus is now king, and he's going to send a message to all the nations as to what he wants them to do next. Verse 6 says, "And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and every kindred and tongue and people. And they will say with a loud voice, 'Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And to worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of the earth.'" So this message described here as the everlasting gospel. So it's essentially the gospel message is going to be sent throughout all the world, and men are going to be told that Jesus is in the earth and that they need to worship him and to acknowledge him as king. So this is a little bit different to the first time Jesus came upon the earth, isn't it? Where it was like Jesus came and he taught to people, and people were given the choice as to whether they were going to listen to him or not. Well, now Jesus is spreading the message that I am king and you need to come to worship me. And you imagine how that message is going to be received. That's going to go throughout all the world. And it's going to go it's going to come right back here to Australia. People who have had nothing to do with God in their lives. To AFL footballers, to Eddie Maguire, that it's going to come if he's still alive upon the earth. It's going to go to America, to Hollywood. It's going to go to Snoop Dogg and Tom Cruise and all these people who are up in the higher echelons of society, as well as the ones in the lower echelons of society, are going to hear this message and they're going to be told, you need to come and acknowledge the King. How are people going to take that? How do you think people are going to receive that message? Well, we're told by the Bible that it's going to be a variety, a mixed bag of responses that will be given to that message initially when it happens. Not everyone's going to be happy with what's happened upon the earth. Now, we're told that there will be collectively certain nations that will submit to Jesus when he calls, okay? There will be a good response from some. Here's an example. In Isaiah chapter 60, verse 9 says, for the coastland shall hope for me, the ships of Tarshish first. Tarshish, we believe, is the nation of England. They're the ones that have just been smashed to smithereens in Armageddon. We're told that they will be one of the first nations to submit to the rule of Christ. Also, some of their allies, described here as the coastlands, shall hope for me. I'm hoping that that's Australia. That we will make up some of the allies of Britain, that we will realise that Jesus is the Christ and submit to him. And it says that they'll be involved, heavily involved in helping to bring back the Jews, the remaining Jews that remain in other parts of the world, to bring them from afar. So your son shall come from afar. So the Jewish nation, the remaining Jewish nation, many of whom are in America, there's plenty in Australia. It's going to be a busy time in Elstonwick, right? As they're gathering people down in St Kilda, they're going to be brought to Jerusalem, and the Jews are going to submit to their king. And these other nations are described, Median and Ephah and Sheba and Kedar and Nebaioth. And these are all Arab nations. We're told that they are going to be some of the first to submit. And isn't that interesting? Like, that's some of the Muslim countries in the world, some of the countries which, you know, people look at and think, oh my goodness, those people are so violent, they're terrible sort of people. These people are going to be the ones that first submit to Christ. And many of these names are related to Abraham. Many of them are related to Abraham through Ishmael and through some of the other brothers. And that whole family of Abraham, which has been separated through time and they've hated each other for generations, are going to be brought together as a giant family. And all of those issues, which the world now, it just finds impossible to solve, don't they? With Palestine and with all these other nations of Iran and all those nations in the Middle East, God is going to, through his Son, solve them all. He's going to bring them all together as one big family. And you know, the other group of people were told, I haven't got any verses up here, there's plenty of verses, of the people who will welcome Jesus when he comes, will be the oppressed and the downtrodden, the weak and the poor. And there's millions of people in this earth, isn't there? Millions of people in Africa and all different parts of the world that are oppressed by regimes and men and have done for generations throughout history. They're going to be the ones, more than anyone else, who will rejoice with their families that finally there's come a man into the world who's going to bring peace and righteousness. And they will come to worship him. But many will not. And many nations will not as a collective. And we're told that one of the main nations that's going to bring a bad response is going to be the nations or group of nations that have opposed God for many, many centuries. Let's just go to Revelation chapter 17 where this is described. All right, Revelation chapter 17, and verse 12 to 14 reads this. Now, there's a lot of symbology in here, and I'm not going to try and pull it apart. I'm just going to explain it very simply to you so that we can understand what is going to happen as an overview. But this period of time is after Armageddon, after Jesus Christ is king in Jerusalem. It says that this is what's going to happen in verse 12 to 14 of Revelation 17. It says, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and their strength unto the beast." So what we're told is there's this group of 10 kings who are going to join together and oppose this man, Jesus Christ, in Jerusalem. Now, there's a picture here, right, of what those kings and what that last system of men is described as in Revelation chapter 17. It's the final episode of the kingdoms of men is going to rise one last time and say, no, we're not going to submit to you, Jesus Christ. And it's described as a red scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and riding upon that beast will be Jezebel, named Babylon the Great, and she will be drunk with the wine and the blood of the saints that have lived from evermore. Now, what on earth is that talking about? Well, it's describing the 10 horns are the same as the 10 toes in Daniel chapter 2. Who were the 10 toes? What nations did they represent? They represented the nations of Europe, all right? When the Roman Empire, which were the 2 legs, broke down, ultimately the last phase of the world when Jesus would return would be the fragmented nations of Europe, which would exist upon the world. And they're summarised here as the 10 horns or the 10 kings. And those verses described for us says that they are going to, in this moment of decision, they are going to give their power to this woman. Who's she? Well, a woman in the Bible is often used as a religious symbol. And she is a religious symbol. And Jezebel, who's she? She's a symbol of false religion, false gods. And that's exactly what she represents. The woman represents the Roman Church, or false Christianity. The Catholic Church was existed in the world. The nations, the beast that she rides on is the Roman Empire, the reincarnation, the final European version of the Roman Empire. And the 10 horns are the leaders of the 10 countries of Europe at that particular time. And they are going to join together to oppose Jesus Christ. And you can imagine what's going to happen, right? In summary, it'll be probably something like this. Someone's going to knock at the door of the Pope at some point when this has all happened. And he's going to be sleeping in his little room there, right, which has got that little window that overlooks the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica. Someone's going to knock on the door, and he's going to get out of his bed, and he's going to open his door, and they're going to say to him, "Have you seen what's happened? Have you been watching this? You saw how Israel was destroyed. Well, someone's come and saved him. And now that person that's come and saved him is standing up in Jerusalem saying that he is Jesus Christ. Surely you know about this as God's representative on earth." And he's going to have a big decision to make, isn't he? In that moment. He can either admit that the whole thing's a sham and say, you know what, I don't know about this, and I haven't got any messages from God. I don't know anything, right? Or he's going to hold to the lie. And he's going to hold to the lie. And he's going to say, that man's the Antichrist. He's got nothing to do with Jesus. And he's going to rally the deepest emotions in the European people. I remember a couple of years ago, you remember when the Notre Dame started burning? That great cathedral in France, that massive cathedral to the Catholic people, right? When you go to France, people couldn't care less about God. Hardly anyone goes to church. But when that thing burnt, everyone came out of everywhere to look at that place. Because deep down inside, they've got the roots from generations of history of that particular religion. And he's going to draw upon that in that moment. And foolishly, stupidly, they're going to buy into it. And many other people in the world are going to do so as well. And look what they then do. Look what the next verse says. Right? Revelation chapter 17, verse 14. And these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Foolishly, they're going to get together an army, and they're going to go to Jerusalem, and they're going to go and try and fight Jesus. That's going to be the final episode in this period of the kingdoms of men. And interestingly, you can see that spirit forming now, as I've said about that example in Notre Dame. This is a $2 euro that you can get in Europe, and it's got this beast with this woman riding upon it. It's in their system. All right, I've got that coin here tonight. It's amazing to look at it. It's like a prophecy of what's going to happen to that nation, that group of nations in the end. So finally, this bad response is going to result in them travelling down to Jerusalem and fighting against the Lamb. And we read about that finally in Revelation 19 and verse 11 to 21. It describes for us this battle. And it symbolically describes Jesus as this white horse, and he's riding upon it. And with him is his army of saints, which we believe will be ourselves with Jesus. And ultimately it says that this group of nations will ride against Jesus. And we read that in verse 19 of Revelation 19. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that was on the horse and against his army. And then this is what's going to happen to them, verse 20 to 21. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, and which he deceived them, and that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone, and the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, with sword proceeding out of his mouth. And all the fowls were filled with their flesh. So that's symbolic language. I don't believe there's really going to be a flaming lava pit where everyone's thrown into. But ultimately what it's saying is these kings of the earth will finally be defeated by Jesus and the saints. And that will bring about, ultimately, a peace throughout the world. And finally, submission will be brought to the world. Revelation 11 says that this is described as the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of his Lord and his Christ. And finally, this will happen at the end here when Jesus defeats the final people that have opposed him. Now, how long is that going to take? From Armageddon beginning to when all the nations are defeated and submit to Christ? Well, some people believe that period of time could take 40 years, right? And there is some evidence in the time periods that is the case. So what that shows us is this thing is not just going to happen overnight, which sometimes we think, right? That Jesus is going to return. He's got this, we're with the saints. We've got these magic fingers that we just, beaming out lasers into the world, and everything just comes into submission. It's going to be a natural process that takes place with men submitting with their hearts to God until finally we get to this moment here. And you can imagine when it finally gets to this point, the world will be exhausted. And it's from this point here, this bit in the orange, from here on in, that Jesus will start to rebuild the world. That's the beginning of this 1,000-year period that will start upon the world. And it's going to start from decimation, and it will slowly grow like that mountain to fill all the earth. I actually love how Jesus described it here in Matthew chapter 19, verse 28 to his disciples. They said, what's the kingdom going to be like? What's our role going to be in it, Jesus? And this is what Jesus said. Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me in the regeneration. That's what he calls the kingdom. He calls it the regeneration. When the Son of Man shall sit on his throne in glory, you also are going to sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. You're going to be with me, disciples. We're going to rule the world. I'm going to be king in this period of time called the regeneration. Now, do you know what that word means? It means the regenesis. The regenesis. And that's what the 1,000 years is all about. It's about turning the world back to Genesis, back to the Garden of Eden. And that's going to be a process that's going to take time. And we're going to be involved in that process as kings and priests working with Jesus and the disciples to bring about this beautiful world that will work in harmony. Now, that's what we're going to look at next week. Our final class is going to be called the regeneration, where we've left war and all that behind, right? People's eyeballs melting. We're done with that period of time. And we're going to go to the period where the world is going to be rebuilt into this beautiful world, not only physically, but spiritually as well. We'll see the world spiritually rebirth in that period of time. So thank you for your attention. Hopefully you found that helpful. I certainly did, to go through all those things and see how Jesus is actually going to bring change into this world. So thank you very much for your attention.